everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely.
Today we're going to be talking about crowd psychology.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and we're going to be using this academic paper by Stephen Reicher. It's simply titled Crowd Psychology.
Okay.
So you might be surprised to learn that crowds aren't just these chaotic masses. They
Yeah.
often act in really organized and meaningful ways.
Right.
We're going to try to bust some of those myths about how crowds think and behave.
Sounds good. Yeah. A lot of assumptions out there.
Exactly. Where do you think some of these assumptions come from? Like, where do these ideas about mob mentality come from?
Well, I think to really understand it, we have to go back in time a bit
Okay.
to 1895.
Mm-hmm.
There was this guy named Gustave Le Bon,
Okay.
and he wrote this really influential book. It was called The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind.
Okay.
And his work, well, it was a product of its time, to be fair to him.
Yeah.
The late 19th century.
Yeah.
Like a lot of intense social change happening,
That's true.
industrialization,
Right.
mass movements.
Right. Right.
The elite were kind of freaked out, like losing control.
Yeah.
And Le Bon, he didn't exactly help calm them down.
So what did he say?
Oh, he basically said that crowds were these, well, dangerous, irrational beasts.
Oh.
And get this,
Okay.
driven by the mental constitution of women, children, and savages.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a little outdated.
Not exactly woke.
Not really.
But his ideas really took hold despite being, deeply flawed.
Wow.
He talked about submergence,
Okay.
where people lose their individuality in a crowd.
Oh.
Contagion,
Oh,
where
yeah.
emotions spread like wildfire.
Yeah.
And then suggestion,
Okay.
where people just become super susceptible to suggestions, often of the destructive kind.
Right. So he was really playing into those fears of the masses.
Yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't just an ivory tower theory either, right?
Yeah.
He was giving advice to leaders.
Yeah. He was telling them how to manipulate crowds.
Oh, wow.
It really fed into that fear.
Yeah.
But here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Reicher comes along, looks at all this, and says, hold on a second. Le Bon got it all wrong.
Okay.
Newer research paints a very different picture.
Interesting. So what does this newer research say?
Well, think about historical studies of events like riots.
Okay.
They actually show that the people involved, they aren't some fringe element of society.
Oh, really?
Yeah, often. They're like typical, well-integrated people.
Interesting.
Sometimes even more educated than the average person.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It is. And there's this report, the U.S. Riot Commission report from 1968.
Okay.
It actually found that those involved in urban riots were, get this, more educated
Really?
and more socially connected than those who weren't.
Wow, I would have thought the opposite.
Yeah, most people do.
Yeah.
There's even this quote. One researcher who studied the riots, they said, restraint and selectivity were among the most crucial features of the riots.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It's not just a mindless rampage, right?
Right. It seems like there's actually a pattern there. Like there's a purpose to their actions.
Exactly. There's a pattern. And, even experimental evidence supports this idea that crowds are actually driven by patterned behavior.
Oh, okay. So how so?
Well, studies on de-individuation,
Okay.
that feeling of anonymity you get in a crowd,
Yeah.
these studies suggest that people actually adhere more to situational norms when they're in a group, not less.
Okay, so if crowds aren't just these like random collections of crazy people, how do these norms develop?
Well, Reicher points to this theory called emergent norm theory, ENT.
ENT, okay.
Think of it like this. Norms gradually spread through interactions and the influence of certain individuals, like trendsetters in a crowd.
Right, so it's not just chaos. There's some sort of organization happening.
Definitely. It's more nuanced than just saying everyone goes crazy in a crowd.
Right.
But ENT doesn't completely answer everything.
Like what?
Well, like why certain norms catch on
Mm-hmm.
and how they link back to societal beliefs and values. That's where things get even more interesting.
Okay, so what's the next level of understanding crowds then?
Well, it's the concept of social identity. Reicher, he argues, that crowds aren't about losing yourself. They're about finding a new we, a shared sense of belonging.
Okay, so it's not losing yourself. It's almost like finding a new self.
Exactly. It's like joining a sports team.
Okay.
Suddenly, you're not just an individual, you're part of something bigger.
Yeah, I can see how that shift from me to we would be really powerful.
It is, and that's where the three key transformations come in.
Okay.
Cognitive, relational, and affective.
Okay, so break those down for me. Let's start with cognitive. What changes in how people think?
Well, cognitively, crowd members actually start to think more alike.
Interesting.
Yeah, they kind of adopt this shared set of beliefs and values that shape their actions. They're literally on the same wavelength.
That makes sense. So relationally, how do those shared beliefs impact the connections between those individuals?
Well, relationally, the boundaries between people, they kind of blur. And it creates this really powerful sense of unity and shared fate.
Wow.
You see these incredible acts of mutual support, sometimes even self-sacrifice.
Mm.
It's all because of this feeling of being connected to something larger than yourself.
Yeah, that's amazing. So it almost seems like in some ways being part of a crowd can actually bring out the best in people.
It can, but what about emotionally? What's happening on that level?
Yeah, what about that effective transformation?
Yes. This is where things can get intense.
Okay.
Crowds, they often experience very strong emotions,
Right?
but it's not because they're irrational.
Okay.
It's because of this powerful shared experience.
Right.
It's like this rush of energy, a feeling of empowerment that comes from acting as a group. Like think about a winning sports team, that feeling of euphoria after a hard-fought victory.
Right. So it's not just about losing control, it's about finding a new kind of control.
Exactly.
Is collective power. That can be really motivating, but I imagine also potentially dangerous, right?
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
That ability to act collectively and to potentially make a difference in the world.
Right.
That's what makes crowds so potent, but also sometimes unpredictable.
Right, yeah. So we've established that crowds are more complex than just these mindless mobs, right? They have a shared identity, norms, and these really powerful emotions. But how does that identity actually play out in the real world? Like when crowds interact with, say, the police or other authorities?
That is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
This is where Reicher, he takes the social identity model a step further
Yeah.
and introduces what he calls the elaborated social identity model.
Okay.
We'll unpack all of that after a quick break.
All right, sounds good. We'll be right back. So before the break, we were talking about the elaborated social identity model, this ESIM.
Right.
What's the elaboration all about?
Well, it's about understanding that crowds, they don't exist in a vacuum.
Oh.
They're part of this larger social system.
Yep.
And their actions are often a direct response to how they're perceived and treated by other groups, especially those in positions of authority, like the police.
So it's not just about what's happening inside the crowd, it's about how that crowd is interacting with the outside world.
Exactly. And here's a key takeaway. You won't want to miss this.
Okay.
The actions of authorities can actually sometimes escalate conflict
Mm-hmm.
and even create the very violence they're trying to prevent.
Really? That sounds counterintuitive. How does that happen?
Okay, so imagine this. The police, they approach a crowd, assuming, they're this dangerous mob.
Right.
Maybe they've been influenced by those old ideas from Le Bon we were talking about.
Right.
So they come in with this show of force using containment tactics. What do you think happens?
Well, I would imagine the crowd would probably feel really unfairly targeted,
Right.
treated like a threat,
Exactly.
even if they weren't even looking for trouble.
Exactly. And that feeling, being treated like the enemy,
Yeah.
it can unify a really diverse crowd, solidify their sense of us against them,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're more likely to actually challenge authority. It's a classic example of those intergroup dynamics at play.
Right. It's like that self-fulfilling prophecy. The authorities are actually creating the behavior they're trying to avoid.
Exactly. And it has some serious implications, like
Okay.
for how we handle large crowds, protests, things like that.
So what are we supposed to do then?
Well, instead of just trying to control crowds with force, ESIM suggests that we need to understand the crowd's perspective.
Okay.
Like, what are their grievances, their sense of identity?
So it's not about escalation, it's about de-escalation.
Precisely. Reicher, he gives this really fascinating example, an anti-roads protest.
Oh, yeah.
It shows how police actions can backfire and actually escalate things.
I remember reading about that one. It was a protest against like a new road development, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the crowd was actually pretty diverse.
It was. There were locals just trying to protect their neighborhood.
Right.
And then you had these more like committed environmental activists who were opposed to road building in general.
Yeah, exactly.
And so initially, these two groups, I imagine they were united in their opposition to the road, but they may have had totally different goals.
Right, totally. They were united, but their motivations were different. So what happened when the police got involved?
Yeah, what happened?
Well, the police, they saw this large gathering, treated everyone as a potential threat, came in with those heavy-handed tactics.
I bet that backfired.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
So what happened?
Well, that shared experience, being treated like the enemy, having their right to protest kind of infringed upon,
Yeah.
it actually brought those two groups closer together.
Oh, wow.
The locals, who initially might have just been concerned about their neighborhood, started to identify with the broader movement for social justice.
Oh, wow. So they went from not in my backyard to
Yeah.
something much bigger.
Exactly. And, their goals might have even shifted too.
Yeah.
What started as this very local issue, like saving a tree,
Right.
it transforms into this more symbolic fight against the authorities, against what they perceive as, this unjust system.
So even if they didn't win, like in the traditional sense, maybe the road still gets built, but they kind of won in a different way.
Right, because that experience, that collective resistance, standing up to power, it can be empowering in itself
Totally.
and even fuel future activism.
That's so powerful. So it's a reminder that crowd behavior is about so much more than just irrationality or chaos.
It is.
It's about identity, it's about group dynamics, it's about how people respond to the actions of others, especially those in positions of authority.
And, this idea that crowd behavior is a reflection of these broader social dynamics.
Right.
It's not just an isolated thing.
Right.
That's something that Reicher, he emphasizes this throughout his work.
Okay.
He argues that crowds can actually be these powerful agents of social change.
Which kind of brings us to a really interesting question. If crowds can be this force for change, what does that mean for individuals who want to make a difference in the world?
That's a big question.
It is, especially given everything that's going on today, It can feel really overwhelming, like your individual actions don't really matter.
It's easy to feel powerless, yeah.
Yeah, but it seems like what crowd psychology is kind of teaching us is that collective action, it can amplify our voices, it can create a sense of momentum, and actually put pressure on those in power to make real change.
It's about recognizing that you're not alone in this,
Right.
that there are other people who share your values, your concerns, your desire for a better world.
So finding those people, those allies, is crucial.
It is, because when we come together, when we organize, when we mobilize, we can achieve things that we just couldn't do on our own.
Right, it's that power of we, but we have to use it wisely, strategically, and ethically, right?
Absolutely. You can be
That is
part of
so-
something meaningful, something that makes a real difference. And I think this deep dive has been so eye-opening. Crowds, they're complex, they're dynamic, they can be inspiring, they can be unsettling.
They can be a lot of things. But they're also just an integral part of what it means to be human, right?
They are. To connect
Yeah.
with others, to form communities, to strive for something bigger than ourselves.
This has been great. What a fascinating look at crowd psychology. It's funny, isn't it? Like how the word crowd, it almost always has these negative connotations.
Yeah, like chaos.
Yeah, disorder, losing control.
Right.
But what we've learned from Reicher is that crowds can be these incredibly powerful forces for good, too.
Absolutely.
They can be catalysts for these huge movements,
Right.
challenging injustice, creating lasting change.
It's true. It's interesting how those perceptions, they're just like so deeply ingrained in our culture.
Yeah,
Even the language we use,
like
like mob, herd, rabble,
right.
all of that. It evokes this sense of danger, something to be feared.
But think about some of the most significant moments in history.
Oh, yeah.
The Civil Rights Movement, the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Mhm.
the Arab Spring uprisings. All of those, they involved large-scale collective action.
Absolutely.
People coming together to demand change.
Yeah, it's like this incredible energy comes out, right?
Yeah.
There's this feeling of solidarity, this shared purpose, and it emerges when people unite around a common cause.
Yeah, and that can be seriously transformative.
It can. And it brings us back to that question you raised earlier. If crowds can be these like potent agents of change, what does that mean for you as an individual wanting to make a difference?
It's a question I think about a lot, especially these days,
I know, right?
when we're facing so many complex challenges.
Totally.
Climate change, social inequality,
Mhm.
political polarization.
It can feel really overwhelming.
It does. Like, do my individual actions even matter?
It's easy to feel powerless.
It is.
Yeah.
But I think that's what crowd psychology teaches us. Like,
Mhm.
collective action, it can really amplify our voices.
It can.
It creates that momentum, and
Yeah.
it can put pressure on those in power to actually do something, to make a real change.
It's about understanding,
Mhm.
recognizing that you're not alone,
Right.
that there are other people who share your values,
Yeah.
your concerns, that desire for a better world.
So finding those people, those allies, that's crucial.
It is, yeah. Because when we come together,
Yeah.
when we organize,
Yeah.
mobilize, we can achieve things that would just be impossible individually.
It's that power of we, right?
Exactly.
But we have to use it wisely.
We do.
Strategically,
Ethically,
you can be a part of something meaningful, something that makes a real difference.
yeah. What an eye-opening conversation. Crowds, they're complex,
Mm-hmm.
dynamic, inspiring, unsettling. But really, they are just a part of what it means to be human.
Right, I think so. Connecting with others, forming communities, striving for something bigger than ourselves.
We'll have a fantastic deep dive into crowd psychology. I hope everyone listening learned as much as I did. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.